Somewhere in China, right now, a solar panel factory is selling its panels for less money than it cost to make them. That's not a typo. That's been happening deliberately for roughly 3 years straight. And, it's one of the biggest reasons solar farms almost anywhere else in the world are making so much money. Start with what a solar farm actually is, stripped of the marketing. It's a very large, very expensive bet that sunlight will keep landing on a fixed patch of ground for the next 25 to 40 years, wrapped inside a stack of contracts designed to turn that sunlight into a predictable, government-supported 20-year-long paycheck. The panels are the least interesting part of that bet. Almost everyone talks about the panels. Almost nobody talks about the land underneath them. The years-long line standing between the project and the power grid, the bank quietly renting out a tax credit, or the fact that the exact same interest rate move that barely dents a gas plant can knock a solar farm's returns nearly in half. Follow the money, from the ground up. Before a single panel goes into the ground, somebody gets paid for the dirt. A landowner sitting on flat, sun-heavy acreage near an existing power line can lease that ground to a developer. Somewhere around $500 to $2,000 per acre, per year, for 20 to 40 years running, often with the rent stepping up by 1% or 2% annually to keep pace with inflation. Compare that to actually farming the same acre. Corn nets somewhere around $50 to $200 a year if the weather cooperates. Wheat, often less. The solar lease pays several multiples more, asks for zero labor, zero seed, zero fertilizer, and doesn't care whether it rains. Some landowners stack a second income right on top of the first, letting sheep graze between the rows of panels so the land keeps producing something else while the lease checks keep arriving. That combination is why, across a huge stretch of rural America, land that used to grow soybeans is quietly growing kilowatts instead. The landowner didn't turn into a power company. They simply found a tenant willing to pay farming's income for none of farming's risk. Then the panels themselves. By a wide margin, this is the part of the business getting cheaper every year. And, well, the reason is happening roughly 7,000 miles away, in China. For most of the last decade, Chinese companies poured money into building solar panel factories, encouraged and subsidized by their own government, until the country's total capacity to make panels grew far larger than the entire world's appetite to buy them. Chinese manufacturers now make somewhere north of 90% of the world's solar wafers, and the large majority of finished panels. When a country can make far more of something than anyone wants to buy, the only way to keep a factory's doors open is to keep cutting the price, even below what it costs to make the product, just to avoid the far larger cost of shutting the factory down. That's exactly what's been happening. Chinese solar manufacturers as a group posted losses north of $1 billion in a single recent quarter alone, an extension of roughly 3 straight years in the red. Smaller manufacturers have been going bankrupt in waves, court filings and all. Even the 6 largest Chinese panel makers, financially strong enough to keep absorbing these losses while their smaller rivals disappear, are effectively watching a crowded industry quietly consolidate, down toward a handful of survivors, simply by outlasting everyone weaker. None of that happened by decree. It happened because losing money slower than your competitor is, for a while, a viable strategy. Sit with the mechanism underneath that, because honestly, it's the real payoff of this whole beat. A factory losing money on every panel it sells is terrible news if you own that factory, and fantastic news if you're the developer buying panels for your solar farm on the other side of the planet. Financial pain concentrated in one country is quietly subsidizing the profit margin of a business somewhere else entirely. That's a shock rippling through a chain in its purest form. And it's not the first time this exact pattern has played out in this exact industry. A very similar wave of Chinese overbuilding, roughly a decade earlier, drove a first generation of solar manufacturers, that time mostly in the West, into bankruptcy in almost the same way. The players change, the mechanism apparently does not. Except the discount doesn't arrive everywhere at the same size. Because governments on the receiving end have their own lever, and the United States has pulled it hard. When a foreign manufacturer sells into another market below its own cost of production, or with help from government subsidies, trade law has a specific name for it: dumping. The American response has stacked tariff on top of tariff on top of tariff, a safeguard tariff, layered under an anti-dumping duty, layered under a countervailing duty, layered under a broader country-level tariff regime, until solar cells and modules routed through Southeast Asia can carry combined tariff exposure worth more than half their landed cost, and material traced back to Chinese origin can face separate duties in the 20 to 30% range, stacked right on top of that. In an earlier, even sharper round of this same fight, penalty rates on a handful of individual exporters were set high enough to functionally end their access to the American market outright. The practical result: a solar farm being built in the United States today is paying a meaningfully different price for the same panel than a nearly identical project going up almost anywhere else on Earth, purely because of where that panel is legally deemed to have come from. The panels themselves also lean on a material almost nobody thinks about when they picture a solar farm: silver. Every standard solar cell uses a thin layer of silver paste to carry its electrical current, and the solar industry has grown into one of the largest single sources of new industrial silver demand on the planet, consuming somewhere around a fifth of the entire world's annual silver supply. That demand helped push silver prices up sharply, more than doubling, over a couple of years. At the same time, the global silver market has been running a supply deficit for 6 straight years running, because most silver is only ever mined as a byproduct of copper, lead, and zinc mining, and can't simply be produced faster on demand the way a factory can. Here's the twist worth sitting with: solar's own success is now working against it. As silver got more expensive, panel manufacturers started deliberately re-engineering their cells to use less of it, some switching toward a copper-based paste instead, trading one scarce material for another. Because copper is being pulled harder than usual by the exact same wave of clean energy and grid build-out, a business partly built on a scarce metal is now quietly re-engineering itself around that very scarcity. None of this requires ever owning a literal solar farm to profit from, or to lose from. A small cluster of publicly traded companies, module makers like First Solar, power electronics makers like Enphase and SolarEdge, racking and tracking system builders right alongside them, trades as something close to a single basket, held together in sector funds built specifically to own the whole group at once. That basket is unusually jumpy. Measured against the broader stock market, individual names in this group have recently carried roughly 1.5 to more than 2 times the average stock swings, and the fund tracking the whole sector swings by a comparable amount. What stands out is how little of that movement traces back to any single company's own results. Within the span of one recent week, a single new government tariff and price floor decision on imported solar material sent nearly every name in the group higher at once: a company already down for the year, and a company already up more than 90% for the year, climbing together on the same morning. Evidence that the move traced back to one shared policy headline, rather than to either company's individual numbers. For an ordinary outside investor, that basket is the most direct way to get exposure to almost everything described so far: the land, the panels, the tariffs, the financing, without ever touching a single acre of ground. And it's also the fastest way to feel every one of those forces land on a portfolio within a single trading session. Now for the part almost nobody outside the industry has ever heard of. And it might be the single biggest bottleneck in this entire business: getting permission to plug into the power grid. A finished solar farm doesn't connect to the grid the moment the last panel is bolted down. It has to wait in a line behind every other power project in that region, solar, wind, battery, or gas, that wants to connect around the same time, while the local grid operator studies whether the wires and substations nearby can handle the extra power without straining. As of the most recent counts, well over 2,000 gigawatts of proposed power projects are sitting in these queues across the United States, more capacity than the country's entire existing power fleet. And a project reaching the front of the line, in one of the busiest grid regions, has recently taken an average of around 8 years just to get there. Only a small share of everything that enters the queue, by some estimates as low as roughly 1 project in 7, ever survives all the way through to actually connecting. Regulators have started reforming the process, grouping applications into batches, charging deposits meant to weed out speculative filings that were never going to get built. But the backlog itself hasn't meaningfully shrunk. Sit with what that means economically. Because, honestly, it's worth carrying with you well past this one industry. A queue position, just the paperwork saying this project is next in line, is itself a scarce and valuable thing, almost independent of whether a single panel has ever touched that ground. Developers routinely buy and sell projects specifically for their place in that line. It's the same underlying logic behind a taxi medallion or a fishing quota. A permission to operate can end up worth more than the thing the permission lets you operate. In solar, that permission slip is where a surprising share of the industry's real scarcity and its real value ends up sitting. Getting past the queue still requires paying for the project. And that's where a player almost nobody pictures, when they imagine a solar farm, walks onto the stage. The bank. The single largest subsidy propping up American solar economics is a federal tax credit, worth around 30% of a project's cost, and potentially 50% or more once extra labor and location requirements are met. Here's the catch. That credit only has value to someone who actually owes federal income tax, and most solar developers are small, growth-focused companies that don't owe very much. So a market grew up specifically to solve that mismatch. Worth tens of billions of dollars a year, called tax equity. A large bank, the likes of JP Morgan, Bank of America, or Wells Fargo, alongside insurance giants such as MetLife, effectively buys its way into temporary partial ownership of the solar farm. In exchange for its cash, the bank claims the tax credit and the accelerated depreciation write-offs, using both to shrink its own tax bill. Once the bank has collected its target return, ownership of the project quietly flows back to the original developer, who keeps the actual electricity income for the following 2 decades. Picture it like renting out a coupon that nobody else in the building is legally allowed to redeem. The developer built the store, but only the bank is permitted to cash in this particular discount. So the developer sells the bank temporary keys to the register, just long enough for the bank to collect what it's owed, then takes the keys back. Neither side would especially want the other half of that arrangement alone. Together, this quiet piece of financial engineering is how an enormous share of American solar actually gets built. That engineering only works if it's worth the bank's while. And that's where interest rates turn into the quietest, most powerful lever in this entire business. A solar farm is, financially, closer to a bond than to a factory. Almost the entire cost is paid up front, in cash and borrowed money, before the project earns a single dollar from selling electricity. There's no fuel bill to manage later, no coal or gas to keep buying, month after month, because the sunlight itself is free. That structure means a solar farm's profitability is unusually exposed to one single number: the cost of borrowing the money to build it in the first place. Research on this point is remarkably consistent across studies. A 2 percentage point rise in the cost of capital pushes the cost of the electricity a solar project needs to charge up by around 20%. Roughly double the hit a gas-fired plant absorbs from the exact same rate move, because the gas plant's costs are spread out over decades of ongoing fuel purchases instead of loaded entirely into day one. When interest rates climb sharply, in the middle of this decade, the underlying cost of producing a unit of utility-scale solar electricity rose from around $38 to around $60 per megawatt hour. In the span of just a couple of years, panel prices barely moved across that same window. The jump came almost entirely from the price of borrowed money. The same rate hike hit every solar company in the country at once. What separated the ones that thrived from the ones that collapsed was the balance sheet sitting underneath the panels. Take the largest utility-scale solar developer in the country, a company that also happens to own one of America's biggest regulated power utilities. That regulated side of the business earns a steady, government-approved profit, no matter what interest rates do, and the company leans on that steady cash flow to keep building tens of gigawatts of new solar and battery storage every single year, with a development backlog stretching past 30 gigawatts, and an enterprise value approaching $300 billion. Rising rates cost this company real money. They never came close to threatening its survival. Now take a very different kind of solar business. A company that financed its rapid growth almost entirely with borrowed money, selling systems with no upfront cost to homeowners, on the bet that cheap debt would keep flowing to fund the next wave of installations. When interest rates climbed and stayed high, servicing that debt got dramatically more expensive, right as new customer growth started slowing. Within roughly a year, that company was reporting hundreds of millions of dollars in losses, and more than $8 billion in long-term liabilities. It eventually filed for bankruptcy, carrying debt in the tens of billions. A major financing partner, working the same corner of the industry, collapsed within days of it. Same interest rate, same underlying industry, opposite outcomes, because one balance sheet was built to absorb a shock, and the other was built almost entirely on the assumption that the shock would never arrive. One more detail here is worth carrying with you, because honestly it says everything about where financial risk actually sits inside this business. Even in that bankruptcy, the tax equity partnerships and the bundles of loans sold off to outside investors had been deliberately structured, years in advance, to sit outside the reach of the bankruptcy court. The bank's money was insulated long before the crisis ever arrived, protected inside a legal structure built specifically for this moment. The operating company alone absorbed the collapse. Weather itself turned into its own category of financial risk, with its own layer of the money chain sitting right on top of it. Insurance. Hail alone accounts for more than a quarter of all natural catastrophe losses on solar farms worldwide, by claim value. And the average hail claim, on a single project, now runs somewhere north of $50 million. One Texas solar farm took a hailstorm severe enough to blow straight through its $50 million hail coverage limit, leaving the owners to cover the remaining damage themselves. Insurers have responded the way insurers respond to any run of expensive surprises, raising premiums, shrinking coverage limits, and in some cases, simply declining to underwrite certain projects at all. Developers have started fighting back with genuinely clever engineering, rather than just paying up, tilting panels to a steep angle the moment a storm approaches, so hailstones glance off at an angle instead of striking flat on. A low-cost trick that can meaningfully shrink a claim before it ever happens. While all of that was happening on the cost side, something unusual was happening to demand. And it has almost nothing to do with homeowners wanting to go green. Historically, whoever bought a solar farm's electricity, usually a utility, occasionally a large corporation chasing a sustainability pledge, signed a long, fairly standardized contract, locking in a price for a decade or two, treated mostly as a budgeting tool. That contract is turning into something closer to a bidding war, because a new class of buyer has shown up wanting enormous amounts of power, fast, companies racing to build artificial intelligence data centers. A handful of the largest technology companies in the world have collectively contracted tens of gigawatts of solar and wind power in the last few years alone, and their contracts increasingly come with a premium attached, cited in some deals around 10% above standard market pricing, to bundle the land, the grid access, and battery storage in alongside the power itself, specifically to jump the same interconnection queue everyone else is stuck waiting inside. Solar contract prices have climbed by double-digit percentages over the past year alone, largely because of this one new category of buyer, with effectively no patience and an extremely large budget. Put the cost side and the demand side together, and a more complicated picture appears than a simple headline would suggest. Construction costs for utility-scale solar have climbed for 5 years running now, driven largely by interest rates and tariffs. Even though most people assume solar costs only ever fall, prices paid to solar farms for their electricity are climbing too. And yet, the amount of new utility-scale solar being built is heading for a record, the largest single-year addition in the country's history, because the sheer size of new demand from data centers is outrunning the higher price tag developers now have to charge, just to make a project pencil out. Where this heads next depends on which force wins that tug of war. If interest rates fall meaningfully, that same 20% per 2 points relationship runs in reverse, and solar gets sharply more competitive again, almost overnight. If the data center building boom cools, or if trade and tariff policy tightens further, growth could stall, even with cheaper money sitting on the table. Both forces are live, pulling in opposite directions, at the same time. Which is exactly why nobody serious inside this industry is treating either outcome as settled. Even the ending of a solar farm's life is a financial event, with its own set of winners. Regulators in most places now require the developer to post a bond, guaranteeing that cleanup money exists before the project is even built, averaging somewhere in the range of $90,000 to $100,000 per megawatt, to fully remove the panels, the racking, and the wiring, and return the land to its original use. Part of that cost gets clawed back, through the resale value of the aluminum, copper, and glass pulled out of the ground. And more often than the decommissioning story suggests, that ending never actually arrives on schedule at all. Plenty of solar farms simply get repowered instead. The old panels stripped out and replaced with newer, more efficient ones, on the exact same patch of land, sitting on the exact same interconnection queue position that took years to win in the first place. Squeezing a second full lifetime of income out of one scarce grid connection. Strip away the panels, and a solar farm is barely an energy business at all. It's a landlord, a bond, a tax shelter, and a spot in a very long line, with the sunlight thrown in for free.